Riot Chapter 4. Brian swam to the spot where the boy had last surfaced. Was this a joke? Had the kid swum underwater? He hesitated, treading water. He didn't want to be the butt of someone's prank. He looked down into the darkness and spotted something white below the surface. With a gulp of air, he dove below. In the cold darkness, he opened his eyes and groped at the white shape. He touched it, a shoe, then an ankle. He grabbed hold and reversed his position, dragging the boy up harder. Harder, pull harder. His lungs ached, burned, ready to burst. Brian broke the surface. He drank in air. "Come on," Kyle shouted. The lifeguard stretched out a long, hooked pole with one hand. Brian grabbed the pole with the other. He held fast to the boy's ankle. The lifeguard leaned over and pulled the boy's limp body closer to the dock. Kyle and Chelsea helped lift him up. Shaking, Brian swam a few strokes to the ladder, grabbed it, and climbed. He hurried over to the boy. The lifeguard was kneeling. "He must have choked down water," she said. She rolled the boy on his side, letting water spill from his mouth, and then she pushed him onto his back, tilted his head, and poised her lips over his open mouth. She inhaled and then blew, her mouth firmly sealed against his, one hand under the boy's chin. Brian was glad she had made it in time for this part. He didn't want to have to give mouth to mouth. Not to a boy, anyway. The boy started coughing like a car engine sputtering reluctantly on a frozen morning, and pushed away from the lifeguard. He rose to his hands and knees, slowly crawled 2 feet away, and threw up over the edge of the dock. His body was ghostly white. "Bri," Kyle said, patting Brian on the back. "He might have died if it wasn't for you." "Yeah, good job," exclaimed the man in red trunks, part of a gathering crowd. "Thanks," the lifeguard said to Brian. "They blocked me. I couldn't get—" She stopped a bit down on her trembling lip. Brian was stunned. 1 minute, the boy was in the middle of a fight on the dock. The next, he was in the water, drowning. 1 minute, Brian was stumbling over how to speak to a girl, and the next thing he knew, he was a hero. The boy stood, wobbled, and then doubled over again, his knobby spine protruding. Chelsea put her hand reassuringly on the boy's heaving back. "You're going to be okay, Cam. You're going to be okay." With her other hand, she reached over and grabbed Brian's wrist. "Thanks for saving my brother," she said. Her hand was warm. "I froze. I hate myself." She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them and let out a breath. "I didn't know what to do." She looked away and removed her hand from Brian's arm. "Your brother?" Brian could feel the warmth of her fingers against his wet skin. Chelsea nodded. "Somebody call the newspaper," a lady in pink shorts and a top said. "That boy should have his picture in the paper." She pointed at Brian. "He's a hero." "Wait," someone else called out. "I saw Nancy Benton on the beach. Maybe she has her camera with her." "Picture in the paper? A hero for rescuing a rat? Wouldn't Dad love that?" "No." Better to slip away quietly. He hadn't meant to get in the middle of anything, but Brian couldn't move. Kyle looked at him and frowned. "Bri, are you feeling all right? You look awful." Brian let out a ragged breath and gazed across the lake at the silhouetted pine trees. He wished he could skip the country and disappear to Canada, which lay on the opposite shore. "Yeah, I'm okay. A woman in a sleek brown swimsuit tapped him on the shoulder. "I got it all with my zoom lens from shore," she said, extending her hand. Brian looked at her hand dumbly and then realized she was talking to him. She shook it gingerly. "I'm Nancy Benton with the Daily News. May I ask you a few questions?" She flipped open a notepad and clicked her pen. "And to think I was going to take the day off. Happens every time," she says to herself. "So, what happened here?" she said. Brian glanced toward the shore. The 3 teenagers were gone. He hesitated. He began. "I'm not sure. I didn't really see what happened." He couldn't tell her what had happened, not if it was going to be in the newspaper. Besides, he didn't know who the teenagers were, and he wasn't lying. Not really. Just not telling the whole truth. "I was diving, and when I got out, I saw this boy in the water crying for help." "What made you dive in after him?" Brian shrugged. He looked over at Chelsea, who was wrapping a faded yellow towel around her brother's thin shoulders. "I don't know," he answered. "Can I go now?" "Just a few more quick questions." After the interview, Brian spotted Chelsea sitting on the edge of the dock, shoulder to shoulder with her brother. She was dangling her feet in the water. She had her head down. Cam was bundled up in a towel, shaking. "Wait up," Brian whispered to Kyle. He walked up behind her. Water dripped from her ponytail down the peachy skin of her back. "Is he going to be okay?" Brian asked. Chelsea flinched and then looked up, her eyes wide. "Oh, good, it's you," she nodded. "Yeah, I think he'll be fine." Brian hesitated, his feet turning to lead weights. He didn't move his arms. He certainly couldn't look her in the eyes. "I'm sorry it happened." "They hate us," said Cam, without raising his head. Chelsea lifted her chin to force a smile at Brian. "It wasn't your fault. I guess some folks have a strange sense of humor, that's all." She crossed her arms over her chest. "Well?" Brian said, and glanced from Chelsea toward Kyle. "Well?" "That's a deep subject," said Kyle. Brian rolled his eyes. He'd kill Kyle later. Better go." Brian and Kyle walked across the beach and grabbed their bikes from the rack. "Why'd they throw him in anyway?" Kyle asked. "Just because he's a rat?" Brian leaned down and unsnapped his black plastic water bottle from his bike. He took a long drink. I don't know. Adults who work for Badget are rats, but I don't know about their kids. Halfway to town, as they biked side by side over the bridge-covered stream, Brian's eyes began to burn. He rubbed them with the back of his hand. He tried not to breathe. The ripe stench hung in the air. The mill's dumping ground had been the source of editorial complaints all summer from people who lived near it. They complained of not being able to sleep at night, of coughing and getting sick to their stomachs, of not being able to sell their houses. Why hadn't Brian noticed this smell on the way to the beach? Maybe the wind had shifted. That's what money smells like, Brian said. Yeah, said Kyle, scrunching his nose up and pedaling faster. It stinks. Leaning his bike against the inside of his garage, Brian stepped toward the door leading to the kitchen. He heard the raised voices of his parents. The whole summer it seemed that his parents did nothing but fight. It hadn't always been that way. He turned the handle slowly and walked inside. Still in her workout suit, Mom squared her hands on her hips. Even the twins knew not to mess with her when she stood like that. Is it really worth it, all this tension over jobs? Brian took off his Nike tennis shoes and lined them up neatly next to Dad's. They were nearly the same size. He pretended not to hear his parents' argument. Worth it? Worth it? Dad shouted. His face dark with anger, he slammed his fist on the counter, something Brian had never seen him do before. Brian pressed his back against the corner counter, hoping to escape notice. You want me to work as an electrician on the road, Dad asked? Leaving home for a month or two at a time? Is that what you want? Tell me, is that the kind of life? As much as Brian hated their fighting, he couldn't move. He wanted to know what was going to go on around town, too. If his world was going to unravel, at least he wanted to know when it was going to happen. It's union bashing, Dad continued loudly, a deep shade of red climbing from above his t-shirt collar. That's what Gold Portage is up to. If guys like me aren't willing to stand up, then pretty soon all us locals will be locked right out of here. When Dad had first used the phrase locked out, Brian had stupidly pictured a fence going up around the whole town, locking out all the union workers, but Dad had explained that it meant not getting work, not getting a chance at all because it was already given to non-union hiring construction company. Pretty soon it will spread beyond this expansion project to the paper mill itself, and everybody will be working for peanuts. The biggest multi-million-dollar project in Minnesota, and we're not getting a piece of it. We're not going to let them take away our jobs without putting up a fight. This is a battle, one that big business and unions and across America are keeping their eye on. If we don't take a stand... Dad? Brian asked, his voice a squeak next to Dad's baritone. Dad ignored him. You think I could have built this house on peanuts? Dad demanded, his arms stretched wide. I'm working too now, remember? Mom said. A sharp smell filled the air. Smoke curled from the edges of the oven door and swirled upward. Mom spun to the oven. Oh, shoot! Brian grabbed hot pads from the drawer behind and yanked the pan from the oven. What should have been broiled salmon steaks looked more like slabs of black moon rock. All this tension, I can't even concentrate anymore, Mom wailed as she opened the door to the garage. Brian carried out the sizzling pan and set it on Dad's tool bench. Thanks, Bri, Mom said. I'm glad you know how to keep your head when someone of us are losing ours. She glared at Dad. Yeah, well, maybe, Dad said. Brian and everybody else around here need to lift their heads out of the sand. Mom raised her hands like a traffic cop. Enough, Stan, she said. Enough. Dinner's already ruined. Let's drop the whole labor dispute and go out to eat like we used to, okay? Let's try to have a nice evening for a change, she paused, letting out a deep breath and then touched his Dad's elbow. Please. Dad shrugged. His anger was already subsiding. I'll go get the twins, she said. She turned away and headed out the sliding screen door. Dad, Brian whispered, stepping closer, I don't want you to work out of town either. Brian didn't like it when his dad took 1 and 2 month jobs away from home. When Dad was gone, home was a blanket with a giant hole cut out of its center. I want to help, he said. Thanks. Dad reached over and tousled Brian's hair. I'm sorry I'm taking it out on the family. It's just that, I don't know. He walked to the kitchen window and gazed out. With his back to Brian, he slowly rubbed the back of his neck. He seemed to have forgotten Brian was there. Under his breath, he said, Tonight we'll show him. Tonight. The word stuck in Brian's mind. He couldn't get out of his mind all through dinner at Jim's Cafe, or when he snuck downstairs to watch the tape replaying Chelsea's back dive over and over again. He couldn't help thinking about it as he fell asleep on his top bunk. What was Dad going to do tonight?